Well, thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Joanna, for inviting me. As Caroline said, this was a project I worked on, finished nearly 2 years ago now, so it's been a complete joy to revisit and hear how other people have tackled similar issues. As Caroline mentioned, I was the Curatorial Trainee at York Art Gallery, and my task was to research the Lycett Green collection of old master paintings. And Lycett Green gave his collection of 135 old master paintings to York in 1955, and they stretched across all European schools. They stretched from the 14th until the 19th century. But the particular focus of his collecting were Italian paintings, as you can see from this image of the collection installed in his country house in Kent. And that's where you find some of the most celebrated and famous paintings in the collection, such as Domenichino's portrait of Monsignore Gucci. However, it's the collection of early Renaissance gold ground panels that are really the jewel in the collection, because as we've said, these are paintings that are actually extremely rare outside of the national and university collections. And as we've already heard and Caroline mentioned, these are some of the most exquisitely crafted objects in the York collection, but they're actually the most frequently overlooked, and some audience research that was undertaken prior to York's closure in 2013, before the 2-year redevelopment project, found that early religious works were the most difficult for audiences to engage with. So I really wanted to address this in my display, and the display was, this particular gallery showed all of Lycett Green's Italian paintings. So like Lucy, I was grappling with having a very wide chronological spread within within the one space, but wanting to really shine a light on these particular objects. So that really, trying to emphasise the quality and the rarity of these objects, really underlay much of the way I approached the display, interpretation and public programme. So the questions that I grappled with, we really had a blank slate, as you can see. Some of the questions when I arrived at this project were, firstly, how to make people reconsider works that they've seen in the permanent collection on the walls for 60 years, how to make them seem exciting and to make people see them afresh. Secondly, how to encourage people to engage with works that seem both chronologically and culturally very distant, and to engage with devotional objects in a secular setting and a secular society. Thirdly, how to present them in a way that lived up to the spectacular architecture of the redevelopment. And if any of you have been to York, you'll agree with me, and those who haven't, you should go to admire the amazing architecture that has been kind of rediscovered. At the Victorian roof that you see there, up until the redevelopment, was completely closed off, so it was a kind of renaissance for the gallery. But despite this, there were so many different things going on for the reopening. The hall you see there was carved into 2 spaces, and the top half was the new Centre of Ceramic Art. And so there was a lot of focus around that, and it was trying to make sure that these tiny fragments were still a source of interest and excitement to audiences. And finally, how to do all this in a very authentic way, really, and to encourage close looking. And goes without saying, trying to do this within budget as well. So bearing all these in mind, I had 2 real main objectives. And the first was really to focus on the craft and the process of making. And I wanted to really draw audiences' attention to the nature of gold tooling techniques, of gilding, of punch work. And that really kind of tapped into other areas of the gallery. There was a big focus on makers and making in the new Centre of Ceramic Art. So it was to try to tap into that. And secondly, to try and create a sense of context and give an impression of the environment in which these objects would have originally been encountered. because they're all small fragments and it's very difficult to present them in a way when they're hung on a wall as a work of art rather than an object that was used for devotion. So I'll just talk through how I went about this through the display, interpretation and public programme. So I presented the works in these architectural groupings. I built the objects out slightly from the wall and put the suggestion of a kind of foreshortened altar beneath, with spotlighting in each section to kind of give the suggestion of a chapel. And in so doing, I wanted to create an acknowledgement of the different kind of visual impact that some of these objects would have had, particularly very small predella panels, for example, that when they're seen in isolation have a very different impact than they would have done at the base of an altarpiece. And juxtapositions I tried to use to kind of bring out some of the themes, such as the interpretation for the Bernardo Daddi. I focused in on the punchwork and the tooling in St. Zenobius's halo, and the depiction of the luxury fabric of the bishop's robe, and tried to encourage audiences to make connections with those in the Puccio de Simone panels either side, and to consider the nature of the transfer of skills within the workshop from master to pupil. The great thing about having this redevelopment was that for the first time we did have a climate-controlled space, so we could actually incorporate loans, and those played a really important role in helping people see these objects afresh. And Caroline, again, was instrumental in helping with these loans. This wonderful complete altarpiece in miniature by Andrea di Buonaiuto da Firenze was a really kind of key way of showing audiences what a polyptych altarpiece would have actually looked like, so that they could place some of the fragments in context. And secondly, to show, you'll see from the Bernardo Daddi, which is framed in this, it's got this kind of deep green velvet backing. And having this loan really showed how the frames themselves were integral to the object itself. You've got these wonderful twisted gesso frames and coloured glass set into the gesso to create the impression of jewels. So it really gave people, I think, a different sense of the overall object and how that was originally conceived. And then we borrowed two panels from the National Gallery of Scotland. And the top piece, the Dead Christ, was part of the Lycett Green collection. And it was from a predella of 5 panels, which was sold in the Woodburn sale in 1860. And 2 panels were subsequently lost. One was acquired by Lycett Green, and then 2 were subsequently acquired by the National Gallery of Scotland. And so this again was just a great chance to show people, for a picture that they're used to seeing, of its place, how it was originally intended to be with these 2 other pieces, and get a greater sense of the artist's style in terms of his depiction of architecture and figures. Unfortunately, we couldn't reframe them or separate them. So I was thinking about the wonderful loan from Dublin being reframed. I thought that must have been a great opportunity, but nevertheless, it gave visitors a chance to compare those pieces. And we also worked with contemporary artists to respond to the collection and present their own responses. Again, this tied in with this focus on making and makers, and of the new Centre of Ceramic Art. The first artist that we worked with was Phil Eglin, the ceramicist based in South Wales, whose work explores devotion and icons, and he's often drawn to the kind of fresh perspective and naivety of child's drawings. So he worked with 5 schools in the York area, and he asked primary school children to draw what they saw when they looked at the York paintings, and then he worked up those images in his studio and transferred them to a number of pots and four dishes for the gallery. So he hoped that that would encourage visitors to, rather than see a depiction of the Virgin and the Christ child, to have a slightly different perspective on the paintings from a child's depiction of a mother and a baby. And the second artist we worked with was Susie McMurray. And Susie's work often involves very labour-intensive, repetitive techniques with a deep engagement with materials. So she was really a fantastic person to respond to the gold punch work that we were looking at in the early Renaissance paintings. And she was particularly drawn to the punch work in the Puccio di Simone border, and she responded to it by drilling hundreds and hundreds of loops of gold wire into the end of the gallery wall, which created this kind of field of light when you entered the gallery. And she really wanted to express not only the glow that a lot of these objects would have had when they were seen in a devotional setting illuminated by candlelight, but also comment on the kind of elusive and intangible nature of faith. And for that reason, it's incredibly difficult to photograph, so you don't really get a sense of what it looked like here. But we did have a fantastic response from this, and it toured to New York afterwards, so it's now a thing in its own right. So moving on to the interpretation, the labels obviously formed our basis of the interpretation, but we had kind of several additional layers. We had an audio guide which focused on particular highlights in the collection, and we also used film. So, for example, we had a film discussing research undertaken on the Bernardo Daddy, presenting the kind of mock-up of the polyptych with the panels with which it has been linked. And we also had a film with Susie discussing her response to the Puccio di Simone. As well as the audio guide, we also had an audio post with some contextual material. So, for example, we had an extract from Cennino's Il Libro dell'Arte and a piece of music by Francesco Landini, whose father had been a painter in Giotto's workshop and was an organist at San Lorenzo. So we used that to try and give visitors the impression of the types of music that contemporaries would have been listening to. And we had a series of blogs as well on subjects including fragmentation, the punchwork, and gilding, and that was kind of disseminated on social media, so engaged people that way, and that was quite a good way of making people aware of the focus of the exhibition before we opened last summer. And then finally, just briefly, the public programme. Our learning events were all built around this idea of the focus on making and of the importance of gold. So we had, as well as having kind of talks and these art shot talks which focused in on particular objects, we had a gilding workshop for adults, gold stamping workshops for children, and then we had a sensory tour for blind and partially sighted visitors, which involved music and incense and candles, and then that was in the studio, and then a tour of the collections. So I hope that's given a sense of how I approached some of the challenges that we've been discussing today in York.